which is also my alma mater. And also his MST, which is Master of Sacred Theology, or as we used to say at the seminary, afraid to minister, or scared to minister, STM. And his Doctor of Philosophy in Historical Theology and the History of Christian-Muslim Relations from the University of Oxford in England. He is a member of the Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa. He has authored a variety of articles, including Martin Luther and Islam, making the case for Christianity, and Resurrection Fact. Dr. Francisco studied Arabic and Muslim theology with a 90% Muslim student population at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. His supervisor was, I'm probably not going to get this right, Yahya Michaud. Did I get that right? And one of the leading authorities on Orthodox Muslim doctrine. Learned from the so-called Sheikh of Islam, Ibn Taymiyyah, something like that. Good. Dr. Francisco has presented to Muslim audiences at places like the Henry Ford Memorial Library in Dearborn, Michigan. He works and teaches with Muslim students at Concordia University, where he has a chair currently. Without any further embarrassment, I turn it over to Dr. Francisco.
Solve a small technical difficulty here.
My handler has to get PowerPoint presentation going here, but just a little note about, well, a couple things. Might as well start off not so serious. It's Saturday morning after all, but my Muslim supervisor, his name's Yahya Michaud, is also named Nasruddin Lebeteliar. He used that pseudonym because in, 1995 or so, he translated an old fatwa, which is like a legal declaration in the Islamic tradition, into French, addressing the question, do Christians in Muslim lands have protection under the law? And the answer in that fatwa was, well, yes and no, it depends on what the Muslim community wants to do. And then it got into a case about, can Christians be executed if they're found proselytizing or doing something that the Muslims don't like? And the answer to that was yes. And interestingly, just as he published that translation, 7 Trappist monks, these are Belgian monks, Catholic monks, had their heads removed in Algeria, and that fatwa was used to justify it. So he gets kicked out of the university in Belgium where he taught, and then he winds up in Oxford University, and that's where sort of I was put under his study. I had no idea about that history, but once I learned of it, I was a bit intimidated by the guy. But over the course of 3 years, we got along quite well, and he told me that his translation of that fatwa was just sort of a historical curiosity. He had no intention on supporting radical Islam or something like that. But that's the sort of weird world we live in, is especially with regard to Islam. There are things, and we'll talk about a lot of these things today, about Islam that are, from a Christian, from an American perspective, very concerning. And but the problem is, or maybe not a problem, but the interesting thing is, though, if you spend much time with Muslims, you'll learn very quickly that most of them are very similar to us in terms of what they want out of life. They want security, financial, physical. They want to make sure their kids can go off to good schools. They want the same sort of rights that other Americans enjoy, at least from their perspective, and so on and so forth. So we'll talk quite a bit about that tension throughout the day. I come from California, as you all know. You might be expecting a flamboyant liberal. being from California, a lot of you, if you didn't see the picture, maybe because my last name is Francisco, you thought, oh, he's going to be tall, dark, and handsome. You only get 1 out of 3 this morning. I'm not tall. Or dark. But what we're going to try to do is be as fair-minded, as objective as possible with regard to Islam this morning. And I just pulled this up. I want to read it, actually. And I hate when people do this, but I'm going to do it anyway, when people read their phones. I'm not a big phone guy, but throughout the day, I want us to keep in mind Martin Luther's explanation to the 8th commandment. The 8th commandment being, you shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. What does this mean? Luther famously always asked, right? We should fear and love God so that we do not tell lies about our neighbor, betray him, slander him, or hurt his reputation, but defend him, speak well of him, and explain everything in the kindest way. Okay? I say that not because I'm some California liberal who's wondering whether my XY chromosome makes me a male or not, and so on and so forth. But because we're talking about people, we're talking about our neighbors in many ways. We are outsiders to Islam. We don't know all the innards. I mean, I've been studying Islam for 20 years, and I'm learning more and more about it as I read more and more. So we're dealing with a subject that we got to be a bit careful with, just as we'd expect Muslims to be careful with their study of Christianity. Okay? So, a couple preliminary matters. There's a way to make this...
The little slideshow.
How do we do it? Presenter view, here we go. Just so it's the full screen. Actually, before this preliminary matter, I stink at using PowerPoint. I know people like it, it helps give order to presentations. You probably all have heard of our Secretary of Defense is, General Mattis, otherwise known as Mad Dog Mattis. I have a bit of what we call in California, a man crush on him, because I admire the guy deeply. He once said famously, there's a bunch of memes on the internet on this, but he once said after attending a presentation on how to fight the war on terror, this is going back over a decade ago, and I guess one of the slides had the names of all the big organizations like Al-Qaeda and all the nation states that harbor terrorists or allegedly harbor terrorists. And then there was these lines connecting them to financial resources, and it was just a big honking mess of lines and circles and terms. And I guess General Stanley McChrystal, you might remember him. He was the one who got fired by President Obama for saying something snarky about the president. But he said, gentlemen, if we could understand all these networks, where all the financing comes from, where all the people are located, we will win the war on terror. And I guess the legend is General Mattis was sitting in that room, and he stood up and said, gentlemen, PowerPoint is making us stupid. I don't like using PowerPoint, so you're going to notice, I don't know how used to seeing PowerPoint presentations you are, but I am just inept. But I'll try my best to stick on point, and I've kind of tried to put images and things on there, but don't expect anything fancy. So, preliminary matters. First and foremost, some distinctions we need to keep in mind throughout the day. Islam is a religion that has 1.6 to 1.7 billion people in it. 1.7 billion Muslims across the world. In America, we have no idea what the numbers are. It's anywhere from 3 to 10 million. It is probably the second largest religion in America, bypassing Judaism used to be, now Islam is. Still, though, in terms of the percentage of the American population, it's still relatively low. But it is very much it's a vocal religion. It's a religion that's very active in the public arena. So it does pose or at least should cause us to be a bit interested. But in thinking about it in the public arena, we got to make some distinctions. And I've got some terms up here like Islamism that maybe you've never heard, but I need to define those terms because I'll use them periodically throughout the day. First and foremost, we need to make a distinction between Islam and what many are calling Islamism. Here's how we're going to define it for the day. And this is not just an arbitrary definition, it's what most scholars of Islam are using today. Islam is sort of the thing that all Muslims have in common. It's the sort of the core teachings, the essence of Islam, the essential things about Islam. You know, belief in one God, a belief that Muhammad was a prophet, and those things that all Muslims share in common. There is a expression of Islam that some call Islamism, which is the ideological version of Islam. It's the view, it's Islam, but it's Islam not just in terms of a belief system. It's Islam and how it affects politics and law. So Islamism is the ideology of Islam. Islam is just, if you will, the religion. I don't know if that makes sense, but that distinction is kind of important to make because there are a lot of, I've got a picture of a few guys down here. This man, Bassam Tibi, is a Syrian-born Muslim. His family had to leave Syria back, I believe it was in the late 70s or early 80s, because they were too liberal for Syria. And he wound up in Germany. He's been teaching at German universities for decades now. Recently retired. He's also a member of the same association that I'm a part of, the Association of the Study of the Middle East and Africa. He published a book most recently called Islam and Islamism, and he argues in there, and whether we agree or not is a totally different question, but he argues that Islam is not the problem. You know, believing in one God, believing in Muhammad's prophethood and all these other things that are particular to Islam, that's not so much of a problem. A person can be a Muslim and believe in the tenets of Islam and not pose a challenge to the political, legal, social arena in whatever country they live in. But, Bassam argues, those who are Islamists do pose a challenge. An Islamist, as Bassam identifies or defines it, is a Muslim who's intent on, in a way, imposing their religious beliefs on the political and in the social arena. You know, maybe maybe to kind of use a Christian parallel, most Christians believe in a distinction between church and state, Lutherans especially. But there are others too. You know, that church and state work alongside of each other, but the state has no business telling the church what it ought to do or teach. Likewise, the church might inform the state in terms of calling the state's bluff in terms of moral failings or something like that, but the church has no business telling the state how government should be structured. Right? In the Lutheran camp, that's usually called the two-kingdom doctrine, if you've heard of that. In Islam, there are Muslims like Bassam Tibi who will distinguish religion from politics and law and all these other public things. They're oftentimes called progressivists. You know, they're Muslims who believe that Islam can, and in fact, as Bassam and this other guy to the left, Majid Nawaz, put it, Islam must change. These two Muslim thinkers here, two Muslim scholars, are actually allies to American Christians, if you will, because, in a way, because they're both saying that Islam historically, for centuries, if that, you know, the way it's been practiced in the past is imposed in, or takes root in American culture, then it poses a real big problem. These two guys are arguing that Muslims should simply embrace Islam, but avoid the temptation to try to change a place like America or England or Germany or whatever so that it sort of abides by Islamic law and Islamic norms. So that's not me trying to say that some Muslims are okay. Some Muslims are in fact okay. It's me trying to be honest and fair to the great diversity that is within Islam. It's very easy, and I've fallen into this quite a bit. It's very easy to hear about Islam as kind of a set of ideas, especially the traditionalist view of Islam, and be outright terrified when you hear about it, and rightfully so, because some of the ideas in Islam, the way it's historically, traditionally been understood, pose serious challenges. So, for example, in the Quran, there's a verse called the verse of the sword. It's chapter 9, verse 5 of the Quran, that says, "Kill the idolaters." Right? And some, historically, not all, and by no stretch of the imagination a majority, but some Muslims historically, traditionally, have interpreted Christianity as an idolatrous religion because Christians say that God is one, but He's three persons within one. And so Christians are guilty of what they call shirk, elevating a created thing to the status of God when they regard and believe that Jesus is the Son of God. So there are things in Islam that are terrifying. It's not good news in like the stuff you hear on Sunday morning sense, not the stuff, the good news heard from the pulpit, right? But the good news is a lot of Muslims out there are not traditionalists, especially here in America. A lot of Muslims they tend towards a progressivism that is moving beyond the historical, traditional formulations of Islam, and thank goodness for it. Now, what the percentages of those who are progressive and those who are traditionalists, all bets are off. You know, you'll see a whole wide variety of data on that, and it'll always conflict. So I'm not going to even try to deal with that. So we need to be very careful with our distinctions. I already made this middle point that we need to distinguish Islam as a set of ideas, ideals, teachings, philosophies from individual Muslims. There's a man, in fact, that lives, or at least last I heard, lives up in Phoenix, who is sort of one of the main narrators in the documentary The Third Jihad. He's a Muslim man, 20 years in the Navy as a physician, very patriotic American, and has for over 10, maybe 15 years, perhaps even longer, sort of led the Muslim charge against extreme Islam. Has led the Muslim charge in exposing the extremist organizations in America. And it's for that reason that he's regarded as, and probably has a price tag on his head. His name is Zuhdi Jasser. But he's a very liberal-minded Muslim who wants nothing more than just the right to believe that Allah is God and worship in a mosque, pray 5 times a day, and the basic stuff of Islam, and also wants to help expose those Muslim organizations in America that are involved in not a conspiracy, but are involved in trying to slowly but surely change the American political and social landscape so that we find Islam more acceptable, that we find the Sharia law as not so offensive, and so on and so forth. So just to be fair, to not falsely represent Muslims in America, be very careful to be aware of these distinctions. The long and short of it is, if you want to know what your Muslim neighbor or what Muslims in Sierra Vista believe, or Muslims in Washington, D.C., or wherever they might be, you got to ask them. You can't just go on Fox News or my friend Craig, or Steve, sorry. You look like Craig Parton to me for a second. My friend Steve, my handler Steve Burns in the back. You can't he likes to watch MSNBC probably. You can't just look at the media and see what's going on in the world today by a handful of Muslims and then sort of abstract from that context and assume all Muslims are a part of this grand conspiracy theory. That's just not accurate. Okay? So just to be, I'm trying to get all the liberal, my inner liberal out in this first little section. Don't worry, I'm not going to go liberal on you though throughout the day. If you're interested, I'm going to have little pictures of books and things throughout. I always get asked questions, what are some resources we should read on Islam or watch, or what are some internet sites we could go to on Islam? And I'll put them up there periodically through the day. But if there's two key thinkers from the Muslim tradition who are leading the charge in exposing radical Islam, the radical Islamist agenda. They're liberal from a Muslim perspective. They're hated by Muslims, but they're Muslims themselves. Are these two guys, Bassam Tibi and Majeed Nawaz. There's more to be sure, but so anything, you'll see these guys on the news and Fox News and MSNBC. They publish books, they write op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and so on and so forth. They're pretty reliable sources from the Muslim perspective on the challenge of especially Islamism or radical Islam to England and America and other places. Bassam Tibi, in fact, is so good at exposing the problems with the traditionalist view of Islam that for, I think, about 15 years now, he's had to have 24/7 security. He's got a price on his head. He's a Muslim man, but he's got a price on his head for exposing the dark underbelly of some interpretations of Islam. In fact, his last book, Islam and Islamism, he says what most people, even in America, refer to as moderate Islam, and he even cites President Obama as referring to moderate Islam and pointing to the institutions that are allegedly moderate. Bassam Tibi says they are not moderate at all. These are Islamist organizations who aren't interested in violence, but they certainly are interested in transforming law and politics in America. So he is, that's why I called him a bit of an ally. He was an insider who knows that world much better than any of us could know. And for my money, he's reliable. So, now to get to the content.
Sir?
Yes?
Where does the term Muslim come from? I mean, why don't they call them Islamists or
Yeah.
Muslim?
Well, real quick, there are, and somebody's recording this, and I know they want to have microphones for questions. Can we save that for the end? That way we can pass around the microphone and you can be on CD or DVD. You're shy? Me too. Anyway, well, I'll answer that question at the end. Okay? You won't be on film unless he records you. You'll just be on audio. All right, so just the sort of the backstory, the basics of Islam. That's what we're going to spend our morning looking at. I mean, after all, and we'll look at history first. It's Saturday morning. Like my students at Concordia University, they get up in the morning just wanting to hear a lecture on history. So I'm assuming that's the case with you too. But you got to do, Islam is a historical religion. It developed historically. It has historic roots. It's, from a Muslim perspective, its truthfulness is contingent upon historical persons like Muhammad. So it's important to know the story and how Islam emerged. Also, though, because as one Oxford historian, Adam Silverstein, put it in a recent book, for Muslims, history is not over. And what he meant by that, he's writing primarily to like an American audience. And it's probably present company excluded. But most Americans, young Americans, don't know what happened 5 minutes ago, let alone 200 years ago. If they do, they don't care about it, right? That's not true from the, in Islamic culture. History is very much alive and well. Good heavens, they're still complaining about the Crusades of the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries. Christians are actually emboldening them to. In 2005 or 6, in the Wall Street Journal, there was a letter that appeared, signed by something like 300 to 400 Christian leaders. Some, very liberal, notoriously liberal Christians. Some pretty important Christians in terms of the way, in terms of pop American Christianity. For example, Rick Warren of Saddleback Church, just not too far from Steve and our houses. But the letter is an open letter in the Wall Street Journal written to Muslim leaders throughout the world. And it starts off by saying to these Muslim leaders, before we address you and how we can all sort of cooperate to avoid this tension between our civilizations, we first want to extend a hand apologizing to you for the Crusades. 700 years ago? Moreover, Protestants are like the biggest critics of the Crusades. Martin Luther being the first in his work on war against the Turk, where he says that if you're fighting in a war against these Muslim Turks in the 16th century, and you see a bishop out there with a crucifix on a flag, run from it as if it's the devil. Wars are only justified if they're defensive in nature. A war cannot be justified theologically. Crusades are completely inappropriate from a Christian perspective, says the Protestant tradition. Yet the signers of that letter were almost to a T, with a couple exceptions, Protestants. They have nothing to apologize for. Right? It's like apologizing for, at least half of my family's side are German. And I like to imagine, though I don't know if this is true, I'm just going to pretend it's true, that my ancestors go back to like the 4th and 5th century. They're like the Visigoths and Ostrogoths who invaded the Roman Empire. It's like me feeling I have to apologize to Italy for that. It's just stupid. Then it goes on, though, the letter is even worse. It said, we want to apologize for the Crusades and the War on Terror. Yeah. So, I don't know why I bring this up, just to get you all inflamed, I guess. So, this history. So, we were talking about the Crusades and how for Muslims, history is very much alive and well. Their figures in history are very important. Muhammad, you've all seen stuff in the news with those. It's not the wisest thing to do, believe it or not, and probably not. It's certainly not the kindest or most charitable thing to do, but people who draw cartoons of Muhammad, right, and purposely to inflame Muslims, I think people have the right to do whatever they want, but it's probably not the wisest thing, because you're going to cause an uproar and you're going to get people killed. That happens not infrequently. So, but a historical person like Muhammad, they still feel a need to defend his honor when he's attacked. This man, you actually pronounced it well, Pastor. Ibn Taymiyyah, that my PhD supervisor is sort of like one of the 3 world's authorities on Ibn Taymiyyah. He's for the Orthodox, that is the centrist, mainstream Muslim tradition. He's to that world as Martin Luther is to Lutherans, or John Calvin is to Reformed people, or Thomas Aquinas is to Catholics. Very important figure in terms of when he interprets a Quranic passage a certain way, his interpretation has tremendous weight. The Mongol conquest of the Muslim world in the 13th century, I'm sure you've read dozens of books on it. It's actually quite important because it brings down the old Islamic empire, the Abbasid Empire, and kind of brings an end to what some call the Golden Age in Islam. But the Mongol conquest, for example, my supervisor, Yahya Bisho, when he moved here to America a couple of years ago, he wrote me an email and referred to how he was being Mongolized. What he meant by that is he was referring back to the 13th century when the Mongols conquer the Muslims. They corrupt Islam a bit. And so he was saying here in America, living in a secular country, he's being corrupted a bit. But they reflect, to their credit perhaps. Don't you wish American youth would reflect historically a bit? When they think about what the founding fathers meant in the Bill of Rights. But they reflect historically. So their history is important to them. It shapes the way they view things. decisions made on how to interpret a passage from the Quran or how to think about certain aspects of Islamic law, even back in the 13th or 9th century, still determines the way things are thought of today. So we got to do a bit of history. Most of you are a little older than me, so I'm banking on the fact that you probably don't mind a little bit of history. We won't go into, this is going to be a very quick overview though. So if you have questions that come up through the lecture, at the end of this talk this morning, we'll set aside about 15 minutes for questions. Not soapbox sermonizing, but questions. All right, first, the question, what are the origins of Islam? You probably know that Islam, or the story of Islam as it emerges, is wrapped around this man named Muhammad. And that's, in terms of the historical record, that's where you should tell this or begin the story. Now, a quick side note. For Muslims who know the details or the content of Islam and the Islamic tradition, not those who just call themselves Muslims, but who actually know it, they're happy to tell this story, but they will oftentimes say that Islam didn't just begin with Muhammad. Islam began with Adam and Eve. And it was passed down through the generations, through prophets like Noah, a prophet in Islam, Abraham, Ishmael, and his brother Isaac, John the Baptist, Jesus, were all prophets of Islam. And the people who followed, who are around these Old Testament figures and a few New Testament figures, for the traditional view in Islam, those people were Muslims. Maybe not in name, but in terms of the content of their faith. So, from a Muslim perspective, Islam doesn't just begin here. It has a long historic lineage. Now, can they prove that? Absolutely not. But that's the belief, so it's important to at least make note of it. So, how does it begin historically? What can a historian say about the origins of Islam? Now, if you know anything about historians, they're not like philosophers in that they're skeptical of absolutely and everything. But historians are notoriously skeptical the further you go back in history in our ability to describe things as they actually happened. And that is most certainly the case with Muhammad. Some will say Muhammad grew up and lived in the full light of history, and they say that to suggest that we know everything about Muhammad. The reality is that's not true. The source material, the evidence, the books, the biography we have of Muhammad, the archaeological evidence we have of Muhammad is all very poor from modern historical standards. So for example, the earliest biography we have of Muhammad dates to about 200 years after his death. Now the Quran we know was written much earlier. But it doesn't really talk, you might assume it talks about Muhammad. It doesn't. It talks more about Jesus, names Jesus more than it does Muhammad. So we got this early biography, but it's 200 years after the events. That's, from a historian's perspective, something to ask questions about. Can we trust it? Certainly, if the information's been passed down accurately, you can trust that source. But the question is, has the information contained in that biography been passed down accurately? It's really hard to answer the question, especially when you read the biography of Muhammad. A lot of it reads like just sort of mundane history. Like, oh, there's no reason why you'd say, oh, this probably didn't happen. But there are parts in the biography that suggest that stuff was added in to boost Muhammad's credentials. For example, and this is an odd one, the Quran says in a couple places, or has a story of how Jewish people approached Muhammad and asked him why he didn't perform any miracles to validate his claims. And usually it goes something like this. The Jews would say, Moses performed miracles, validating his claims to be a prophet. Why don't you do it, Muhammad? And Muhammad would always respond, I've not been given the authority to perform miracles. So Muhammad doesn't do miracles. But the biographies suggest that there are lots of miracles that attend Muhammad's life. One of those, it's probably one of the more famous ones, is in like around 619 AD is when it's usually dated. Muhammad gets up in the middle of the night, and outside of where he's living is a Pegasus, a horse with wings. Interestingly, the Pegasus is named Barak, not B-A-R-A-C-K, but B-U-R-A-Q. So there's this Pegasus. He gets up, he climbs on the back of this Pegasus. Now, believe it or not, Pegasuses, I think that's how we say it, don't exist. So that's one strike against the account. But he flies from Mecca all the way to Jerusalem. And when he lands in Jerusalem, he landed, according to tradition, right where that rock is, underneath the dome of the rock. And from there, he ascended up through the heavens. And as he's ascending towards God, he has conversations with some of the old prophets, Abraham and Moses and so on. And then he comes back down and gets back on the Pegasus, on Barak, and flies back to Mecca, and presumably goes back to bed. Now, some Muslims will say, oh, that's just a metaphor, right? But historically, it's always been believed that that is a true historical account. For heaven's sake, they've got a mosque, the Dome of the Rock, dedicated to where he landed in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the third most holy city in Islam. So you've got miracles like that in the biography. Another one that's perhaps a little off color, but I'll tell it anyway, is at Muhammad's birth, as he's leaving his mother, coming out of the birth canal. Allegedly a light comes out as well that illuminates the whole globe. As if to say there's something special going on here. Now, those two events and other miracles that are accounted in the biography, I'm not opposed to, I really do believe miracles, I'm a Christian, right? I believe miracles happen historically. But you don't just believe any claim to a miracle. Right? It's like if I told you back in my office in Concordia, I have a real live pink elephant. That'd be kind of miraculous. Now, you'd probably be skeptical, but you couldn't completely dismiss me if you want to be really honest until you go back to my office and see if there's that pink elephant there. You'd find out there isn't one. Maybe if I had some sardines that were a little off, I might be seeing one, but there isn't one there. So it's with Muhammad's miracles, the problem is not that there are miracles in the text. The problem is every single one of them took place when there are no observers of it. They're always sort of done in private. So that's what makes me suspicious. In addition to that, the Quran saying Muhammad didn't perform miracles suggests that maybe these stories are added into the biography to boost his prophetic credentials. So, in terms of what we can know about Muhammad's life, we can know some general stuff. We know he existed, to be sure. We know he did something remarkable, historically speaking. And we know some of those events, but we don't know all the details. We'll talk more about this a little later on after I tell the traditional story of Muhammad's life. So, here is his dates. These are about dates. 570 AD to 632 AD is when Muhammad was alive. He's born in the city of Mecca, which the Arabian Peninsula there is in that dark green in that little globe. Mecca is about halfway down the western side of the Arabian Peninsula, or Saudi Arabia today. Born there, his early life is not really, there's not a whole lot going on. It's kind of tragic, actually, because his father died right before he was born. His mother dies when he's pretty young. He's passed around his tribe, first to his grandfather, and then he ends up under the custodianship of his uncle. And his uncle, at an early age, just simply brings him along in all of his business enterprises. In particular, his uncle was a trader. Meaning he would take leather and spices and dates and other things from Mecca to the north up into a place or an empire called Byzantium, the old eastern half of the Roman Empire. In particular, they go to marketplaces in Damascus and Aleppo, basically the region of Syria. And what that tells us, though, is that if that's true, and there's no reason to think it isn't, Muhammad is a man who experienced a couple different cultures as he was growing up. In Mecca, he's surrounded by Arabs who have a traditional religion that is very polytheistic. And we might add animistic. They believed in a whole multitude of gods. Think kind of the Arab parallel to the Greco-Roman pantheon of gods. They believed that physical things had spirits associated with them. So he's used to that context. It's even said that that structure, the Kaaba, the big black square that's in Mecca, when Muslims go on the pilgrimage, you'll see something in the news about it. Usually there's people getting trampled to death when they circumambulate it. It's sad, but it happens every year. Allegedly in that building, before Muhammad becomes or sees himself as a prophet, it's filled with over 300 idols that the Arabs would worship annually. So he's used to that, he knows that context. He also is up in Syria, though, which is part of the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century. Byzantine Empire is thoroughly Christian, or of what we would call like an Eastern Orthodox sort. Right? So he's also a man who knows the claims of Christianity. So he's heard the claims of monotheists, people who believe that there's only one God, but a Trinitarian monotheism. And between Byzantium and Mecca, there are pockets of Jewish populations. So he's also heard the Jewish version of monotheism. So he's a man who's been exposed to different things. This is going to come into play later on when I'm going to suggest that Islam is actually the product of, it's actually an Arab innovation where they cobbled together ideas from different religions into a new religion. So he's exposed to a bunch of different things. For 40 years, from 570 to 610 AD, not a whole lot happens in his life with regard to the story of Islam. There is one event that's kind of important. When he's about 25 years of age, a woman who was recently widowed, who was of a tremendous amount of wealth by 6th century Meccan standards, proposes to Muhammad marriage. Her name was Khadija. And, I mean, he's 25, she's 40, she's wealthy, he's not. Who wouldn't take her up on the offer? And when he marries Khadija, he no longer has to work as hard. It's not that he gets lazy. He just doesn't have to work so hard to put food on the table. So his life kind of changes a bit when he's from 25 years of age, from about 595 to 610 AD. In the biographies, it suggests that Muhammad spent those 15 years contemplating the big questions he had always had in life. When he's young, in his teens and his early 20s, he's busy. He doesn't have time to think of deep thoughts, right? But after he's married to Khadija, he can ask himself questions like, well, what's the true religion? He knows about 3 of them, maybe even more. So to Muhammad's credit, perhaps, he's not like the millennial postmodern American who thinks that something can be true and false at the same time. Or that we all have our own truths, right? He's not a relativist. He believes that if the Jews are right, that there's only one God, and that Jesus was not the Messiah, that means both Christianity and the Arab polytheism he grew up in are false. Right? So he's probably wrestling with these sorts of philosophical ideas, trying to figure out what's the true religion, what's the nature of the world around me, and so on. And the biographies suggest that he spent most of his time thinking about these things in a cave. And here's where things get interesting. In 610 AD, in the 9th month of the Arab calendar, which is based off the phases of the moon, a month called Ramadan, he's sitting in the cave after 15 years of asking himself these questions. And he starts to feel a presence in the cave, and then he hears a voice. And the voice tells him he's to proclaim something. The Arabic is ikra, to call out. And Muhammad says, or to recite as it's usually translated. Muhammad says, I don't know what I'm supposed to say. And the voice says, recite again. And Muhammad says, I have no idea what I'm to say. And then the third time, this is found in Quran chapter 96, verses 1 through 5. It's believed to be the first time God, the Creator, revealed himself to Muhammad. The voice says, recite or claim that God is the creator of all things and that he has taught human beings by the pen. This is a paraphrase of Quran 96. If you go there, you can go there yourself and find out exactly what it says. But the voice identifies itself as being God, the creator of things, in particular humankind, and also a God who has revealed himself, who is through the pen, that is, through prophets who have written things in the past. Now, the fascinating thing about this story, I mean, I've probably been saying lots of things are fascinating here, but interesting thing about this story is when Muhammad has this experience, the biographies and the Quran suggest he's a bit suspicious about the authenticity of this voice. The Quran, in fact, says or suggests that he believed that maybe the genies, the jinn, like demons of the desert, were toying with him, that he might be possessed. And the Quran on one occasion has as its context Muhammad climbing to the top of a cliff, and he's about ready to jump off because he thinks he's demon-possessed. And a voice comes again and says, get down from there, you prophet, rise up and warn the people. That's probably about 3 years after that first encounter with this, or that first experience in the cave. And eventually, though, it takes a little while. Eventually, though, Muhammad starts to believe that that experience in the cave, that voice he heard, that presence he felt, was the presence of an angel named Gabriel or Jibreel, who had been sent down by God, Allah in Arabic, to communicate the words of Allah to Muhammad, so that Muhammad could then go back to Mecca and begin prophesying to the people of Mecca. And that's the way that the Islamic tradition interprets the revelation that's given to Muhammad. So Muhammad goes to Mecca, back to his hometown after that experience, and up until 622, he'll see himself as just a prophet to the people of Mecca, and that's it. And if you go to the Quran, one of the tough things about understanding the Quran is it's not, first of all, it's kind of hard to read. Most translations, there are some real modern translations that are good, but most of the ones that you'll get, if you go to freequran.org, I'm sure you go there a lot in war room and to diminish their supply. You have to give them your personal address though, so think about that. But it mostly reads like King James English. And it's tough to read that way, but it's also tough to read because the Quran is not put together in an orderly way. It's not chronological. So I told you Quran chapter 96 verses 1 through 5 is the first bit of revelation given to Muhammad from the Muslim perspective. So it's put together, we don't know how or why the Quran was put together that way, but it's not put together chronologically. So if you want to figure out what Muhammad's teaching in those days when he's in Mecca, you kind of have to know what you're looking for. Most of the stuff in the back of the Quran comes from this early period. It's usually just called the Meccan period. And if you go to the Quran and the biographies and try to make sense of what Muhammad was teaching, what Islam was comprised of in those early years of Islam, it's really basic stuff. Muhammad tells the people in Mecca, who again are polytheists, they believe in a multitude of gods, he tells them that this is wrong. There is nothing worth worshiping. There are no gods but Allah. So there's only one God. He begins preaching a message of monotheism. There's only one God, and He is Allah. Second thing he starts preaching in Mecca is that those who don't turn from their false religions, like polytheism, now he won't mention, and actually early on he's quite generous to Judaism and Christianity. That'll change later on. But to polytheists in particular, he tells them if you don't turn from your false beliefs, believing in all these different gods, when you die you're going to go to hellfire for eternity. So let me ask you a question. How do you think that message set? Or how do you think it was received by people whose ancestors were all polytheists and they themselves were polytheists. That's kind of a rhetorical question. Didn't sit so well with them. And throughout this Meccan period, up to 622 AD, Muhammad's not very successful. Maybe 100 followers. His wife was his first follower, Khadija. Then his cousin Ali, the second follower. He doesn't get a whole lot of followers. He's persecuted. Islam is a manifest failure in Mecca by earthly standards. In fact, the biographies suggest that the people of Mecca, because Muhammad's causing a bit of social turmoil by saying, your religion is wrong, and all your dead relatives, they're not just laying in the dirt in their graves with the worms crawling in and crawling out and playing pinochle in their snouts, as Shel Silverstein described it. They're in hell. Right? That sets the social context. So the biographies say that there were a couple attempts on Muhammad's life in Mecca. 622, though, is kind of a pivotal year in Muhammad's life because his wife, Khadija, had died at that point. He only had one wife up until Khadija's death. Then he'll take about 11 other wives afterwards. Never mind, I'm not going to say any more about that. Especially because there's a video camera right in front of my face. But it'd take up to 11 wives later on. But 622, he will, he hears that there's an assassination plot on his life, he will get word from a city to the north. It's now called Medina. Back then it was called Yathrib. It's about 170 to 180 miles north of Mecca. It's recently been settled by Arabs and some Jewish tribes. So you got polytheists and Jews there. And it's recently settled. Nobody can agree on how who should be the governor, what the religion of the city, the official religion of the city should be, and so on. But they've heard there's a man down south who's claimed to be a prophet, and he's a neutral third party. So they go down and they find Muhammad there, and they propose to Muhammad that he migrate. It's what's called the Hijra, migrate out of Mecca and settle in Medina in 622. In fact, he does that. And he's given authority over the city, both politically, militarily, and also, we add, religiously. So he's got the best of all possible worlds there in Medina. And that period is called the Medinan period. It lasts from 622 until his death in 632. That's the last 10 years of Muhammad's life. And if you go to the Quran and pull out the passages from this period, this is where Islam becomes much more nuanced and detailed. The stuff, for example, Quran chapter 9 verse 30 says this: the Jews say Ezra is the son of God, the Christians say Jesus is the son of God, qatalahumullahu, may they forever be damned. Compare that to a verse from Mecca early on where Jesus says to the Muslims, the nearest in affection to us, the closest to us in terms of their religion, are the Christians. Deal with them well, treat them kindly. Tell them that their God and our God is one. So you get these, between the Meccan and the Medinan period in Muhammad's life, you get at least these tensions or paradoxes, if not outright contradictions. How do they typically, historically resolve these tensions? It's called the doctrine of abrogation. The view is that whatever comes later in Muhammad's life, if it contradicts earlier stuff, the later material cancels out the earlier stuff. So if you want to go, if you're probably tomorrow you're all going to go to Barnes & Noble. Is there a Barnes & Noble in Sierra Vista?
No.
Okay. Well, you go to Amazon.com, you order your Quran, you'll probably start your Quran studies, right? If you want to know what Islam is about, like from a primary source level, like its most authoritative central document, you got to read the Quran. And if you want to know what it's really about, you got to know which passages come from Medina. That's the stuff to focus on, because that's where all the nuance is. That's where all the laws of it, not all the laws, but that's where Islam becomes not just a monotheistic belief in one God, but all of a sudden becomes a religion that has a legal side to it and a political side to it as well. One more thing about the last period of Muhammad's life is in the Medinan period, it's also where we start to see Islam becoming aggressive. Very early on, it's most say within 9 months of moving to Medina with all this power, Muhammad tells the people of Medina, the recent converts to Islam, the Muslims who came up from Mecca, in chapter 2 in particular, Muhammad says to them, on this day, fighting, and the Arabic behind that is from the root qital, which means killing. Fighting is prescribed for you, even though you might not like it, God knows what's best for you. And from there you get this, this sort of expansionistic trajectory in Islam. It's not necessarily all putting heads on chopping blocks and things like what you see with ISIS, but it is, you start to see kind of an imperial dream begin to emerge in Islam, that they see themselves as destined to, as Quran chapter 9 verse 30 puts it, to prevail over all other religions. So now that will come into play when we tell the rest of the Islamic story a little later. So in any case, by 632, the stuff that will go into the Quran through the mouth of Muhammad is all out there. It's contained in the memories of his companions. It's not written down yet. And then in 632, Muhammad dies. And the question soon arises, what do we do next? And there's lots of things, but two big things. One is, how do we preserve the message of Muhammad? Do we just keep it in our memories? Or do we write it down? Muhammad never gave instructions to write it down, so can we do that? And the eventual answer is yes, we have to do that, otherwise we're in danger of losing the message. It takes about 20 years, but the Quran will eventually, the message that Muhammad preached as an alleged prophet of God is put down in the Quranic text around 650 AD. The other question that's asked is, what do we do in terms of, as a people, as a state here in the Arabian Peninsula, what do we do? And the answer comes very quickly. Well, we expand. And within 100 years, a little more than 100 years, Islam is going to grow by leaps and bounds in terms of the territory it supervises or governs. I'm going to pause there, though, just for a moment, because it looks like, am I correct in thinking we got about 15 minutes left in this session? Okay, so let's pause here. If there are any questions relative to what we've just talked about, we'll address those, but you got to speak on it through a microphone, and we'll pick up the rest of the story after we come back from, I think we have a break, is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
15-minute break after.
If you can't tell, I can go on and on forever, so it's important that we do these breaks, otherwise you'll all be falling asleep and get irritated with me. Yes, sir?
Where do the names come from? Islam and Muhammad, and not Muhammad, but Muslim?
Okay, so good question. Islam is a noun, and also what we might call a gerund, a verbal noun. It means submission. It does not mean peace. It's not even derived from salam directly, which is the Arabic for peace. It means submission, and if you want to if I can define it a bit more, it means submitting to God so that you can experience peace with God. You could define it that way, but it just means submission. If you want to learn how to say, I will not submit, there's t-shirts with this, Lanas Taslim. I will not submit to Islam. But Islam means submission.
So why don't
Muslim.
they call it Islamist instead of Muslim?
Say again?
Why do they call them Muslims?
Okay, so Muslim is the participle form of Islam.
Oh.
It means one who is in a state of submission to Allah.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so you could use it as an adjective.
I see.
But an individual person who subscribes to Islam is a Muslim.
I see.
They're not Islams. I've heard that. Islam is more of a noun in that
And
case.
then are you going to get into Sirah and
Yep.
Hadith?
Yeah, we're moving there.
Is there any other questions for me?
You said that not the progressives, but the traditional Muslims wish to change our history, our foundations, and our government, and put in Sharia law. And from what I've read, that seems to be a big issue with them. Wouldn't that make it? I'm just playing devil's advocate here. You say that there are these sort of moderate Muslims that just want to live and be happy and don't want all that Sharia law stuff. But if the Islamists win, wouldn't those moderate Muslims just follow along? Wouldn't they be forced to accept all of the restrictions and so on?
Outstanding question. Let me just go here, back real quick. I got to give credit where credit's due. Maajid Nawaz has a book called Islam and the Future of Tolerance. And he argues this, and this is going to, I don't want to split too many hairs, but he argues that there are basically three kind of dispositions in the global Muslim population. On the left side of the spectrum, you've got these progressivists who believe Islam can progress. It can leave behind its traditional kind of imperialistic, theocratic roots. On the other side of the spectrum, you've got these Islamists who are not all violent, but some aren't. But the one thing they all have in common is that they have their end goal is the reintroduction of Islamic law in Muslim majority nations first, the restoration of what's called the caliphate, the sort of the central type of Islamic governance. That's their immediate telos, or end game. Some of them will do it violently, some of them will do it through lobbying or whatever things. Then he says the overwhelming majority of Muslims are in the middle. They're what he calls just conservative Muslims. That is, they are not going to leave behind Islam. They have a deep respect for the ideas that animate Islamism, but they could swing another way. They also they have just basic human concerns, their children and so on. He says that the problem here is that the number of progressives are very small. They're marginalized, and most recently he's drawn attention to some weird stuff going on, especially in America with our supercharged, politically correct environment. So a bit of a story about Maajid. I'm sorry, I told you I could talk forever. In 2001, September 10th, 2001, he landed in Egypt, Cairo, Egypt, to do his third year, his Arabic language year. He's Pakistani and never learned Arabic growing up. He speaks Urdu and English, very eloquent in English. But he had to do a third year in Arabic, so he decides he's going to go to Egypt. He's there September 10th, 2001. September 11th, next day, he's hooded, taken by van to basically what they call the dungeon in the Egyptian security headquarters, and charged with being basically a radical Muslim. Egypt has a long history of arresting, torturing, exiling like Islamists. He's of course one of these guys, because early on he was a member of an organization called Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is located out of London. They are also here in the United States, which is one of these Islamist organizations that says we're not going to fight physically. We're going to fight politically. We're going to fight in the arena of public relations and so on. But they make no bones about it. They're up front right from the get-go. Their goal is imposing Sharia wherever they can and restoring this caliphate. So he's arrested for that, gets thrown in an Egyptian prison when he's in his early 20s for 6 years, and he's in prison with other guys who are part of the same organization who are being electrocuted. Egyptian security is pretty, not just aggressive, but pretty awful if you're on the wrong side of it. after 6 years, though, unlike what usually or typically happens in prison where people get hardened in their ideology, because he was hanging out with guys who had been in those prisons for 20 years, because they're rounded up right after Anwar Sadat was assassinated, they're part of that whole cabal, they had gone over the 20 years become kind of soft in their Islam. So he's hanging out with those guys, and Majid becomes very liberal in his interpretation of Islam. In that he believes in one God, the Prophet Muhammad, and all these other things, but he thinks that the mosque and state, or religion and politics, are not one thing. They should be separated, just for the sake of human beings being able to flourish in a pluralistic type of society. So anyway, I'm going to try to make this story short. He's released after 6 years, goes back to London, is on a list in London of people that the British security are watching as a potential terrorist. On that list there, and then he winds up on a list in America, the Southern Poverty Law Center's list of being an anti-Muslim bigot. So in England, he's a potential jihadist. In America, because he's gone soft on Islam and all the, some of these Muslim organizations who use like the social justice warfare stuff, because he's critiquing traditional Islam, he's seen as an anti-Muslim bigot, though he's a Muslim man himself. So anyway, back to the stuff about the progressives. He says the progressives are few in number, and to make matters worse, they're marginalized by the Muslim community, because what they're saying is so not traditional. It just doesn't gain any ground amongst the conservatives. It'll never gain ground amongst the Islamists. Add to that, Americans, he says, this is him, not me, he says, Americans have fallen for this how does he describe it? This weird social justice thing that says you can't critique Islam at all. Even if you're a Muslim, you can't critique it, otherwise you're guilty of hate speech. So he says, not only are the Muslims against me, now the Americans, the one nation that preserves in its constitution the right to free speech, you're not even protected there. So he says, we're small in number, everybody's against us, and yet we're the ones who are going to be able to persuade these conservative Muslims, or could potentially persuade conservative Muslims not to go in the direction of Islamism. But he and the other guy, I keep going back and forth, Bassam Tibi, they're both optimistic with their message, but very pessimistic on whether or not they're going to be successful. In terms of numbers, Bassam Tibi is pretty strong. He says the prevailing interpretation of Islam today is Islamism. It might be dressed up with a happy, smiley face, but in terms of the underlying worldview, it's Islamist from start to finish. It more often than not is not violent in terms of using brute force, but certainly is aggressive in the political arena.
So are most of the imams today of the
You gotta wait for the microphone. Sorry.
So would you say that most of the imams of the mosques are the traditional, what do you call it, Islamist type? So they're leading the flock.
Yeah.
Essentially, you have to get
This is hard to answer. I've not been in every mosque in the U.S. I've only been in a handful of them. And it's a mixed bag. So for example, do you remember a couple of years ago that newly married Muslim couple who were murdered by some, I don't know what, he was some sort of like white supremacist or like a real serious anti-Muslim bigot. This is in Raleigh, North Carolina. I think it's about 2 years ago. The guy just goes to their door. I think he lived in the apartment next door, knocks on the door, and they had been married for I think 8 weeks or something, and just opens fire, and then her sister's there, kills them. That Muslim couple were reared in a mosque right there that has an imam who's very progressive. I think if he were here, I think he is a bit slippery. Like he'll take passages from the Quran out of Quranic context. to spin like a peaceful interpretation, but if you look at it, look just at like 2 verses after the one he just quoted, it helps explain what he's talking about, and it's actually much more aggressive. But in that mosque, though, they had a substitute preacher on one Friday who somebody videotaped a sermon he gave that was very anti-Semitic. So you get like a progressive guy one day and then an Islamist guy the next day. So it's really hard to say. The most recent data suggests that, generally speaking, the ones who go in the direction of Islamism, the homegrown type of Islamists and terrorists and so on, they typically are not associated, they don't learn their rhetoric in mosque, it's usually online. So some have argued, I don't know, but some have argued that, actually there's one Christian author who says we should support certainly the very right of a mosque to exist places, because mosques are allies in trying to circumvent the move towards Islamism. I don't know if that's right or not, but the data seems to lean or support that position. So I don't want to be flip-floppy here, but I want to be careful, to be honest, or to be fair to the facts.
I wanted to, pardon me. I was surprised when it comes out gravelly. I wanted to go back to 2 questions. Both of them are part of the history that we've been talking about. One is, I seem to remember you saying that in the cave, the message that Allah had given to Muhammad was to write what he was saying. But then I heard you say that he never did.
Right. So it's, the word is Iqra. And the way it's usually translated is recite, as if he's supposed to recite, chant, if you will, from a text. And that's like the real literal interpretation of it, though sometimes it's interpreted as he's supposed to write or proclaim or whatever. But he never wrote, not every, but most Muslims would tell you that Muhammad was illiterate. So it's complicated. I hate to get out of it that way, but that's true.
But it's okay. It's an interesting, seems like a contradiction almost. But the other one is, I was wondering, I've been under the idea that also around in the area at the time were Zoroastrians.
Yeah.
And so they were also monotheistic.
In a way, yeah. Dualistic monotheism to make things complicated for everybody, but yeah. But, and there are some things in the Quranic text and in Islamic theology that seem to maybe have been borrowed from Zoroastrianism. The Zoroastrians claimed that, and Manichaeans along with it, we're introducing all these weird terms, but claimed that the Christian scriptures were corrupt, and that's a Muslim claim as well. They got, changed over time. So, but we'll deal with that particular question later on. It's complicated as well. We have, I think we're
at it.
Right.
Yeah, we've got about a 15-minute break, is that correct?
Yes,
and we'll pick up where we left off. And now I got all my squirrelies and spazziness out. Hopefully start slowing down a bit.
No,
fine.
you're awesome.